a major feature of the referendum was wholesale bribery. BET went to local pubs, rounded up people, and took a whole load of ne'er-do-wells into the town hall to vote against the council's plan and bribed them by paying them a shilling each.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Wommer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. In this episode, we have three principal segments. So first of all, we're going to bring listeners up to date with progress with the Railways Bill, which has been continuing to make its progress through the UK Parliament and concluded its stages in the House of Commons earlier this week. We'll also take a look at the opening of the electrified test track at the Long Marston site by Porterbrook, which took place recently. And then we'll be considering Mick Hamer's book on the conspiracy to eliminate tramways from vast swathes of the United Kingdom, and considering what that tells us about tram and light rail policies in current times. Loyal listeners will know that there's been a process of mainline rail reform going on in Great Britain since 2018, under the previous Conservative government and the current Labour government. A flagship element of the Labour government's programme is the Railways Bill, which has been making its way slowly but steadily through the UK Parliament. Earlier this week, the bill completed its stages in the lower house of the British Parliament, the House of Commons, with the report stage and the third reading. And a number of very significant issues were covered in the debates, being raised by the opposition parties where there were areas of concern, and also clarified by ministers before the bill was finally approved. It was always intended under the previous government that there would be a process of putting track and train back together under what they called a guiding mind, which would be Great British Railways. The Labour Party adopted the name, slight terminological change because they wanted to have a directing mind rather than a guiding mind. But the big difference between the Conservative and Labour positions was that Labour envisaged returning all of the privately operated, franchised train operations to the public sector through a process of renationalisation as those contracts came to an end. And listeners will recall that back in the first months of the Labour government, the Public Ownership Bill was passed, the Passenger Railways Public Ownership Act, I think that it was called, which enabled the process of those franchises coming back into public ownership as they expired. The second stage of the process was another parliamentary bill, the Railways Bill, to create Great British Railways. And that wasn't introduced to Parliament until last December and has been making its way through the House of Commons, the lower house of the British Parliament, since then. We've covered the processes leading up to the publication of that bill and the contents of it. And on the 10th of June, the bill completed its process of going through the House of Commons. So this was what was known as the report stage and the third reading. So the whole House of Commons considered the process of detailed scrutiny that had been undertaken by a committee of MPs earlier this year. That's why it's called the report stage. They were reporting back on that process. Now during that process of detailed scrutiny, it was the job of the opposition to try to sort of tease out, prise open weaknesses, deficiencies in the bill through the tabling of amendments and the
did they manage
raising
to
of
do that?
issues. Well, they tabled hundreds of amendments, actually. They certainly did. To be fair, they did a pretty thorough job, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, in testing some of the details of the bill and some of the principles of the bill, actually. But the government has a built-in majority in the House of Commons and its committees. So it meant that every single one of the opposition amendments was voted down. So at the report stage on the 10th of June, the opposition parties were allowed one more go to put forward amendments. And like clockwork, all of those were again voted down by the government majority in the House of Commons. And this is kind of par for the course in our parliamentary system when you've got a party with a majority.
Was it a well-attended meeting, or was it 8 people and a dog?
No, there were actually quite a lot of people around for the votes anyway, not necessarily for all of the debates, but with the votes, they were of the order of sort of 270 or so on the government side, and 160, I think it was, or so on the opposition side. So people did turn up, and it was regarded as an important. And the debates went on for several hours, and quite a lot of MPs spoke. In some ways, what's more interesting from a legislative point of view is what this process has brought to light, which will now be explored in the upper house of the British Parliament, the House of Lords. Right. Because in the House of Lords, the Labour government doesn't have a built-in majority. And also there are issues are, shall we say, exposed or explored much more thoroughly on their own merits than simply on the basis of party loyalty. So it is possible for the opposition to put together sort of coalitions of views and interests to, from time to time, defeat the government in the House of Lords. And indeed, they even managed to do this during the earlier public ownership bill working its way through. A couple of times they were able to defeat the government, albeit that those changes were reversed by the government later on using its majority in the House of Commons, which it has the power to utilise. So I think we saw in the Commons debates on the 10th of June, the opposition kind of for the last time setting up the issues that they'll be bringing forward again in the House of Lords in an attempt to sort of defeat or force the government onto the back foot.
And so, what are those?
Notably, that is good. That notably, Christian, I think one of the key issues that they coalesce around is the question of open access.
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah. We've discussed this several times on Calling All Stations. So, for listeners unfamiliar, or particularly listeners abroad, under the Great British Railways model, the vast majority of passenger trains will be operated by the public sector, either Great British Railways itself or the equivalent bodies for Scotland and Wales. But there will still be some provision for private sector operators to seek to identify paths that they can apply to use for trains that will run to some degree, at least, in competition with the public operators. And this has existed right through the 33 years of the privatised railway in Great Britain, as well as the franchised operators fulfilling government contracts, there were these sort of more buccaneering open access operators that could come in and find niche markets that they could develop and exploit. So, I think it's fair to say the predisposition of the government, although they've blown hot and cold over this at various points, their predisposition is to be somewhat sceptical about the role of open access operators.
That's because they argue they extract revenue, and the revenue is actually taxpayers' money.
That's right. And particularly with a publicly owned railway, they would be saying, well, every pound that an open access operator earns in ticket revenue is a pound that's being taken away from the taxpayer-backed public service. And on the flip side, as you might expect, the Conservative Party, is rather supportive of this sort of buccaneering, entrepreneurial type of operator, and wants to see more of them. Though, funnily enough, when they were in government, they were a bit more sceptical themselves because they were responsible for the taxpayer cash themselves. So it's amazing what a dose of opposition can do to change your outlook. And the Liberal Democrats are similarly quite supportive of open access operators. So that's one clear area that I think we're going to see some debate around. And related to that is the position of freight as well, because freight operators are not being renationalised, and they will continue to bid for paths to run their services.
Yeah, they're effectively open access, aren't they? Although they get some paths kind of guaranteed, but yes,
they are. And the big difference with the regime which will operate after the legislation is passed and implemented, the big difference is that the allocation of those paths was hitherto carried out by an independent body, the Office of Rail and Road. But now that is only going to be an appeals body. It will be Great British Railways that decides what paths can be released for open access passenger operators and freight operators. And the big complaint from the Conservatives is that this is Great British Railways are effectively poacher and gamekeeper. So
right, I think we're going to get representative of the freight industry onto calling all stations in the near future, I think.
Yeah, to hear those issues being explored. So I think we can see that is an area that will be very much explored in the House of Lords. Another one is kind of related, is about ticketing. So over the
again,
decades,
I predicted that was another one.
No surprises here in some ways. Over the decades of privatisation, there's been the emergence of independent ticket retailing on Britain's railways, and in fact, many particularly sort of Generation Z people, rail users, will tend to go to these independent ticket retailers because they have a more kind of customer-friendly interface over
our kids,
mobile devices.
Your kids and my kids, I'm sure, all use these independent ticket retailers, don't they?
They do. They tend to view them very positively. Whereas the kind of mindset of the people promoting the publicly owned integrated railway is, well, look, this is our product. We should be able to sell. We should be the primary retail outlet for our own product, and we shouldn't be necessarily dependent on these independent sources, which sometimes, in some cases, charge commission, and again, possibly could be said to be abstracting some revenue.
Yeah, they get a
from the railway business.
It's supposed to be only 3 or 4, 5%.
It is a pretty tiny margin. Yeah, that's right. It's in the area of independent retail that the government has made some concessions during the committee stage of the bill, and seems to be willing to allow perhaps a higher degree of toleration of that kind of activity than might have been implied by some of the things that they were saying earlier on. And I think the third area that the Conservatives concentrated on quite heavily in these final debates in the House of Commons, it did come up earlier as well, is their attempt to kind of caricature or characterize the publicly owned railway that's emerging as a kind of 1970s union dominated monolith run for the benefit of the workers rather than for the public. And so they've tried to introduce key performance indicators that the government says are unnecessary to try to sort of force the introduction of productivity measures and efficiency measures and cost reduction measures into the system. Now, they haven't got anywhere with that in the House of Commons stages, but are likely to have a go, as I was saying, in the House of Lords. But in a way, Christian, what the debates in the House of Commons were almost a sideshow this week to something else that went on in the rail reform process, because the government had pledged, given an undertaking, that before the bill went off to the House of Lords, it would publish a list of all the remaining documents, statements, and reports that need to be published before Great British Railways can actually be established. And that list came out just before the report stage and third reading in the House of Commons, and it makes some very interesting reading, because by my reckoning there are 14 documents needed, and only one of them so far has been published.
These are things about rolling stock strategy and what the role of the guiding mind.
Let me give you a few examples from the list. So the one they published is a GBR license policy document that sets out the design of the new accountability framework for GBR. It's not the license, but it's a process for how to get to the license. And then some of the other 13 include rail freight growth targets for 2040, a long-term rail strategy discussion paper, a summary of memorandum of understanding between the new passenger watchdog and the Office of Rail and Road, a rolling stock and infrastructure strategy, Great British Railways implementation timing, a retail code of practice consultation. That's the thing to do with how the independent ticket retailers will be dealt with that we were just discussing, a draft access and use consultation that deals with issues about operators such as open access and freight being able to get onto the network, and so on and so on. I won't go on with the entire list, but it shows it, and it shows that we're still a long way from Great British Railways actually being set up, and the target date for that seems to be the end of 2027. So the law, this bill will become law probably before the end of 2026. Great British Railways gets set up, I think, before the end of 2027. So that will mean if you take the totality of the rail reform process under the two governments that kicked off with a crisis in timetabling in the summer of 2018. That's May 2018. Yeah. So you'll be not far short of a decade from the whole process being completed to set up Great British Railways. And I contrast that, and it's in a way it's a lesson of how difficult it is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, by comparison with the process of privatising the railways, which was completed from start to finish by John Major's government in one 5-year
1992 to
parliamentary
1997.
term.
1992 to 1997.
That's
well,
right.
I mean, that's a fantastic summary, and well, there's going to be a lot more to discuss with each of those documents on calling all stations, which we'll probably look at each of them in turn as they come out. So it certainly gives us a lot to do. But, that's a great summary. And clearly, this is a very early stages, as you say, and so much more to actually sort out. So listeners, I hope, will kind of want to hear more from us.
Earlier this month, train financing company Porterbrook opened an electrified test track at its Long Marston site in the West Midlands. Christian was lucky enough to be there for the opening ceremony and interviewed Mary Grant, Chief Executive of Porterbrook, on the significance of this investment. Here's their discussion.
I'm with Mary Grant, who's the CEO of Porterbrook, and we're at this amazing new test track, which I think is actually Britain's first proper test track for railways. So, Mary, what's all this about, and how come a leasing company, famous for being a Roscoe, is now in the business of providing a test track?
Well, Christian, I think the purpose of this is about the future. So here we are at a point in time thinking about where our railways are going. And you're quite right to say, what would a financier be doing with having a site like this? And my answer back to that is saying, we've been part of the industry for the last 30 years. I think to be a responsible partner for the next, we have to demonstrate how we support an industry. And in financing and being able to bring our capital to building such a facility helps the whole of the industry and will therefore help us provide a far better service when we're bringing new trains into operation in future. Will help with training, both drivers, onboard crew and our engineers. So we are taking a 30-year approach at this, and that's why we said we can get a hold of this site. We bought it in 2024. We spent upwards of 75 million on it already.
This used to be an old army site.
It was an old military engineering site, and that ceased operation back in 2000. And it has been used for various ad hoc storage over the years. But when we took the site on, initially on a lease in 2021, we didn't have any road infrastructure, the lighting was poor, we didn't have the right security systems, and we certainly didn't have any of the facilities. And of course, the track was there, but anything beyond 5 miles per hour, you were at potential risk of not staying on the track. So of course, when we were able to buy the freehold in 2024, we said, okay, let's do it. Let's not wait to be asked to do something. We're going to go and do this because that's what a private partner in this industry should be doing.
But of course, you are a business. You must have a business case for this. You must be, hopefully, making some money out of it.
Well, we will. I mean, we're long term. Remember, everything we do is over 30 years. We don't make any money on a train till even after year 20. And that is how the facilitation of private capital supports this industry as well. And we take the risk of that. And we're saying this site represents the long term. We are long-term institutional investors that own Porterbrook, and they recognise 30-year planning, 30-year investment, and therefore they look at longer-term returns.
So tell me the sort of facilities you're going to offer here.
So first and foremost, we've got a 3.5 kilometre test track, and that will allow you to go up to miles, up to speeds in excess of 50 miles per hour in certain sections of the track. But as you know, a lot of that shakes down everything you need to know about a train. We then have asset management facilities. So something's maybe cropping up on the diagnostic systems, has to go in, has to be checked over. You can then do that on site. Then you can get back out and test again because you can just go round and round and round in a loop.
And we've had nowhere in Britain to do that.
Not to date, we haven't.
Right.
And of course, what this will then give the manufacturers and the operators much more confidence is when that train is ready to go out on the main line, and paths are scarce. We're running a very busy timetable as it is. That when they're going out on the operation at mainline speed to do the vital brake testing and the other things that you have to do, you do that with confidence because you've shaken down any of the gremlins. But for me, what's really important, this test track unlocks all that potential of support. But the other aspect that's really important is all the training. our driver training, our onboard crew training, and our engineering in a very safe, considered environment to support that confidence and ensure that when these new trains are going into service, our passengers can and should expect the reliability from the get-go.
And you've also got quite a lot of storage facility. Presumably that's also part of the business.
We do. And from time to time, we're required and asked, and we're already talking to many of our manufacturing partners at the moment about storage. We've got warm storage, so of course we can keep the systems running. And of course we can then do vital maintenance work on them as well, even if they're not in a particular testing environment at that point in time.
Well, thank you, Mary. That's really interesting. And, I hope this is a success and well used. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Christian, it was a pretty impressive experience then, the Long Marston test track.
Yes, I have to say, I think this is a real example of the private sector adding genuine value to the railways. And, over the years, I've been pretty critical of, private sector investment, which has not really been forthcoming apart from the rolling stock companies, but they have a very nice business model and make a healthy profit. But I think Porterbrook have been very brave here in really establishing this test track. And I can't quite see how they're going to make a vast amount of money out of it, but they've spent, as Mary Grant said, £75 million on it. And it is very impressive. We whizzed round it a couple of times in a train. It's amazingly smooth. The trains can only go 50 or maybe 60 now miles per hour as a maximum. So, it's not going to be a speed trial, but it will, as Mary Grant says, offer the opportunity for, driver training and testing of the vehicles and so on. And of course, there's also, as part of the business model there's a huge amount of storage space there. This was, as she said, an old army railway depot and testing facility. So, I think this is pretty encouraging, and it would just be nice to see more private companies actually taking this sort of risk.
We're used in modern life to having to filter out the bombardment of conspiracy theories to which we are all too often subjected. And perhaps that raises the danger that we might miss a genuine conspiracy when one is unearthed. Well, in his new book, The Great Tramways Conspiracy, Mick Hamer talks about just such a real conspiracy to rid Great Britain of its tram networks, which took place during the 20th century. And Christian's been talking to Mick about what he's discovered.
I've always been curious about why trams in this country were killed off, with the exception, of course, of Blackpool, but why we lost all our trams, this amazing system that existed in most towns and cities and was a very extensive system in London. And yet all these trams disappeared, whereas in other countries, notably the Low Countries and Germany and Switzerland, the tram systems basically survived, even if some of the lines were closed. And I've always wanted to find out why this happened. And lo and behold, my old friend Mick Hamer, who I worked with a long time ago on the New Statesman and various other places, has produced a wonderful book called The Great Tramways Conspiracy, the covert campaign that killed off the British tram. So I thought I would ask him onto Calling All Stations to really explain why we lost all our trams and, in fact, the difficulties that trams faced throughout their existence. So, Mick, thank you for coming on Calling All Stations. Can you start off maybe with a bit about the start of your book, where you explain that trams actually always face some opposition and struggle to establish themselves at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century?
Basically, anyone who wanted to carry passengers around cities opposed trams. So you got the railways. I mean, there was no sort of common community of interest between the railways and tramways. You got horse riders, carriage owners. There was an outfit called the West End Tramways Opposition Association,
Which lasted quite a long time, from what you said.
which lasted a long time. It was basically to do with preserving sort of the rights of carriage owners, horse carriage owners, and was run out of Tattersalls, the bloodstock auctioneers.
So basically, you're saying that any other users opposed the idea of trams, and of course, the motoring lobby then kind of contributed.
Well, indeed. I mean, once you got to the turn of the century into the 20th century, then your horse traffic disappeared, and you got motorists, and the motorists sort of thought that they'd inherited the right to have the roads to themselves, and they hated trams because you tended to have tram lines in the middle of the road, and that was to enable things like the brewer's dray and the coal merchant to deliver at the side. And so when drivers wanted to overtake, they would find themselves in the middle of the tram lines and possibly a tram coming the other way.
Tell me, what was the advantage of trams, and who used them? I mean, basically, they were rivals to the railways, weren't they, as you suggested? But they were very popular.
They were extremely popular. I mean, until the late 1920s, more people travelled by tram in Britain than travelled by bus.
Wow. So
it was only...
Who were those people? Who were those people?
Well, there were a lot of tramways in industrial areas. So, I mean, miners, dockyard workers, shipyard workers, people like that used to use trams. But they were also widely used by, in London, certainly by secretarial women, office workers of various sorts, clerks. You know, they all took the tram because it was cheap.
So was it more a working class thing than a middle class?
It was partly more of a working class thing. I don't think it was entirely working class. There were quite a lot of middle class people, especially in London, and also in the suburbs of some big cities, who used trams. I mean, it was convenient, it was quick, and it was cheap. So why not use the tram?
Again, just give an indication, most towns and cities had trams.
Most towns and cities had trams of any size. And trams were a very, very important industry. I mean, you're talking about trams using something like 10% of the electricity that was generated in the country. And for every 7 trams that ran on the road, it employed 2 people down the pits, 2 coal miners.
Wow.
This was a big industry.
The trams were gradually electrified and gradually made municipal. Can you maybe explain how they came to be in municipal hands, and what percentage were in municipal hands?
Well, when trams first appeared in Britain, it was entirely a private enterprise project, but they were given leases generally of 21 years length. And at the end of 21 years, councils had the right to buy out the trams. And a lot of them exercised that right. And I mean, the poster boy for municipal trams was Glasgow, which, I mean, the company that ran the trams until the 1890s was put on a very poor service. It was very expensive. The trams were dirty. Glasgow swept that all away. And produced a service that was very prompt, reliable, clean, electrified, because they electrified the trams. And it was altogether far superior to the old private companies. And the basic reason for that is that if you've got a business enterprise like a tramway, you don't have to pay the shareholders a dividend. So you can actually plough the money back into the system and make it more efficient and better and more attractive.
So councils all around the country began to municipalise their tram systems.
That's right. and it coincided with the changeover from horse to electrification. And at the same time, you had this outfit, British Electric Traction, which ran a lot of tramways and had aspirations to create a lot of even interurban trams in Britain. They wanted to monopolise tramways.
When you say interurban, like a tram that would go from one town to another.
Indeed, from one town to another, not just serving the people of one town. And they fought tooth and nail to try and prevent municipalisation. And there was a very, very strident campaign in the early years of the 20th century, run by British Electric Traction, also the railways, to try and prevent trams being taken into municipal ownership. And you got this cry from the railways in particular, of rate-aided competition, because the railways were losing traffic to these electric trams because they were much more local. Over short distances, they took people from where they wanted to be and to where they wanted to go. And the railways were sort of struggling with steam locomotives to try and compete with the electric trams, and they were losing out. But they put it down to rate-aided competition, and so they claimed that the councils were subsidising the trams. It was quite false.
We're talking maybe the first 20 or 30 years of
before the First World War, I'd say.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about maybe 1903, 1904, 1905.
Right.
And the big test case was Birmingham. The council wanted to take over the trams, and BET, British Electric Traction, fought this vitriolic campaign. There was a referendum. The city held a referendum over whether they should take the trams into public ownership, which the city won. A major feature of the referendum was wholesale bribery. BET went to local pubs, rounded up people, and took a whole load of ne'er-do-wells into the town hall to vote against the council's plan and bribed them by paying them £1 each.
How extraordinary. And but they still lost.
They still lost.
And so we've got two different kind of groups here. So we've got the councils wanted to run them, and British Electric Traction. That was just the one big company. They owned a lot of.
They owned a lot. They owned something like 60, 70 local tramways. But there were other private companies, obviously. It wasn't the only one. And having lost in Birmingham, British Electric Traction sort of rather withdrew because they were spending a lot of money on something which was pretty unprofitable. And then you got the councils taking over trams in large numbers. By the 1920s, after the First World War, or probably slightly before the First World War, about 90% of trams in Britain were owned by councils.
Oh, so BET largely pulled out.
Well, it still had it still had some tramways, and indeed some of them went on to the 1950s, but it ceased to be a major player. It was the councils that really ran trams. And this is one of the reasons why trams declined, because you had this division between the council-run trams, the municipal trams, and the private enterprise-run trams. And the two sectors hated each other and wouldn't cooperate. I mean, there was very little cooperation between them. And politically, the industry was divided, so it never spoke with a united voice.
And you outline in your book that there was a dirty tricks campaign by the BET. They kind of got campaigns in the Times and all that sort of stuff.
Well, indeed. I mean, they used to do things like writing letters to the press saying how great private enterprise was in running trams and running power stations, because that was an important part of their ambition. It was mostly false. And a lot of local papers were bribed to carry the letters and paid, I think it was a penny a line to carry the letters.
And okay, let's then fast forward towards the demise of the trams. When did that actually start? Because I think from your book it starts well before the Second World War, doesn't it? That we start to lose system.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of consolidation after the First World War, but the network of trams continued to grow until about 1928, something like that. It wasn't sort of in. I mean, it was an industry that was consolidating rather than in retreat. There was a little bit of growth, not a lot. I mean, it was small beer, really. And that continued until the end of the 20s. But what happened in the 20s was you suddenly got in the newspapers a whole series of articles, letters to the papers from people who said that trams were outdated, they were obsolete, and they should be scrapped. And this Scrap the Trams campaign was orchestrated. Now, by 1925, you were getting something like twice the volume of letters saying scrap the trams as you had in 1920. And I managed to identify one of the key organisers behind this campaign. It's a publicity technique which these days is called astroturfing, which is very common on social media, and it's designed to create the impression of a grassroots movement, a grassroots feeling, in this case that trams were obsolete.
So this is long before the days of social media.
Well, and long before the days when the word astroturfing was coined, because AstroTurf didn't exist back in the 1920s. But yes, I mean, it was long before that, and it happened in the correspondence columns of local newspapers. And local newspapers were really quite, I mean, local and national, but local newspapers were much more important than they are now. More people read local newspapers than read the national papers.
Right.
And so there was this continual theme of trams being obsolete and anachronistic, out of date, old-fashioned. It's time they were scrapped.
But before we find out who was behind this, was that not true? I mean, were trams maybe obsolete or not very useful anymore?
It's like astroturfing campaigns today. There's an element of truth. There was some very ramshackle old trams kicking around, and some, particularly in the private sector, some companies were finding it very difficult to keep up with track maintenance. And part of their problem was that they had to pave to maintain the track, and the buses were getting heavier, and the bus drivers liked to run up the tram rails because they were better maintained than the rest of the road. So the tram industry basically had to pay to maintain the road for the bus competition.
Right. What was the beginning of decline of trams, though? Did that date from around then that systems started being closed?
Well, not until, I mean, basically the publicity campaign, and it was a publicity campaign, and I've uncovered evidence that shows that, well, circumstantial evidence that Shell was helping to finance this campaign. It really had its effects when the Royal Commission on Transport was set up in 1928. Now, the Royal Commission on Transport was a peculiar outfit. It was 12 men, and they were all men, of course, and they heard evidence over 3 years from not a single woman. Not a single woman gave evidence. And they were much impressed by the articles in the newspapers saying trams were obsolete. And they kept on asking witnesses, are trams obsolete? And you got tram managers who said, no, they're not obsolete. You got the trade unions who said, no, they're not obsolete. They've got a bright future for modern trams. You got civil servants from the Ministry of Transport who said they weren't obsolete. You even got transport economists, and that was a pretty rare breed back then. You even got transport economists saying that they weren't obsolete. But the Royal Commission, which had a number of very keen motorists on it, and they hated trams, decided to side basically with tittle-tattle from motoring journalists and say that trams were obsolete. And they recommended the abolition of trams as soon as possible, and that report was produced in 1931.
All trams. They just
All
said,
trams,
Right.
not modern, old, whatever.
And what was the effect of that?
Well, in 30 years, the trams disappeared.
Right. And you think it's a direct consequence of that report?
It certainly is a direct consequence of that report. In London, you had there was a particular sort of sideshow. Well, not really sideshow, because London was actually fundamental to transport policy in the country. But in London, you had this effort by Herbert Morrison. Herbert Morrison was the leader of the London Labour Party, and he ran a campaign saying, "Hands off the people's trams." Now, this was when the Combine was trying to take over the
Who was the
Sorry,
Combine?
the Combine was a collection of underground railways and the London General Bus Company, now, and generally known as the Combine for short. They were trying to take over the LCC's trams. Now, that's the London County Council's trams, which was a very efficient and well-maintained system. And they wanted to get their hands on it because it was so good. And Herbert Morrison ran a campaign to try and prevent that. The campaign was extremely successful. There was a local by-election in Battersea South, which was fought basically on the tram issue. And Labour won that by-election from ejecting a Conservative who had been there for a long time. And the swing in the 1929 election, the swing against the Conservatives and for Labour in the 1929 election was particularly pronounced in London and tram seats where there were lots of tramways. So it helped Labour gain power. Having gained power, Morrison backtracked on that, set up London Transport, nationalised London Transport, which meant nationalising the Combine and the London County Council. And he gave London Transport in the legislation power to make it easier to abandon tramways.
Right.
And that was basically part of the negotiations between the Combine and Morrison. And essentially, London Transport was a combined takeover of the LCC,
Right.
London County Council.
And then they began to phase out trams in London?
Well, there was a little bit of a start made in 1931, but in 1933 was the crunch meeting, where London Transport was now set up, and Lord Ashfield, who was the chairman of London Transport, ran London Transport not through board meetings but through chairman's meetings, sort of little hole in the wall sort of affairs. Not quite, but that's exaggerating. But his tram managers, two of them, came to him and said, put forward a plan for renewing all the track in North London. And he said, no, I'm not going to have that. And the tram managers were told to go away and produce a plan for replacing trams with trolleybuses. And one of them refused and resigned and left it.
And so that was the beginning of the end of
Well,
trams.
that was the beginning. I mean, you can trace to slightly before that, the Combine, that is the private sector tramways, produced a new tram, which was called the Feltham. Now, it was a modern tram, 1931. It was based on research, good, solid research. It was very quick, very attractive, very comfortable, and very popular with lots of people. They built 100 of these trams, and
the route master of its day.
Well, probably slightly more plush. I mean, the newspaper headlines referred to them as trams deluxe.
Right.
They built 100 of these trams, and then they applied to the Treasury to build another 250. Now, the Treasury at the time had a scheme for subsidising public works in order to fight unemployment. So this is 1930, about 1930. And there was 1929 possibly. There was a Treasury committee which examined these proposals, and at the same time, London put up, the Combine put up a plan to extend the Piccadilly line. Now, on the Treasury Committee was someone from the Department of Transport, a civil servant, who knew what was in the Royal Commission's report, even though it hadn't been published. He knew what was in the draft report, and he knew that the Royal Commission was recommending the abolition of trams. And the Treasury Committee said yes to extending the Piccadilly line, no to building any more Felthams.
But so you argue this is a conspiracy. Where is the conspiracy? So the commission was full of motoring lobby people, so I can see there's a bit of a kind of conspiracy there. But where is the conspiracy?
Well, I think you have to look at the oil industry. The oil industry was supporting this publicity campaign, this astroturfing campaign.
Who was running that?
Who was running that? Well, the key organizer was this man who was a economist, stockbroker, jobbing journalist, who lived in the Inner Temple in London. And he organized this.
What's his name?
His name was Ernest Harold Davenport.
Right.
Who later went on to become an economic advisor to Harold Wilson's first government.
Oh, wow.
And he organised this astroturfing campaign. His target wasn't just trams, it was also branch lines, it was also diesel, trying to replace steam locomotives with diesel locomotives, trying to replace coal in ships with oil. And he also ran a campaign completely unrelated for the Bank of England over Australia's borrowing.
Right.
So
he organised this campaign by getting local people or local to write.
He wrote some of the letters, but he also had a stable of letter writers,
right,
which he clearly organised. And his flatmate and best friend was another former barrister who'd also worked for Shell, like Davenport, because Davenport was freelancing for Shell. And he was a former MI5 officer. In fact, his brother-in-law was the deputy director of MI5. And the flat was actually used as an MI5 safe house.
From where they worked?
Where they worked.
Wow.
He had other addresses. He had a country address, he had a club, but Davenport was freelancing for Shell at the time he was writing these letters, and the letters were all designed to expand Shell's sales of petrol, particularly petrol, but also oil more generally, at the expense of competition.
So the conspiracy had its kind of great moment when it got the commission to produce a report saying that trams should be abolished. But then what happened after that? There must be lots of councils making decisions all around Britain to close their tram systems. And were they doing that because that was government policy, or why?
Yes, it was undoubtedly government policy. It became government policy. Initially, when the Commission produced its report, the Ministry of Transport was quite lukewarm about it and didn't think, thought some trams should go, but didn't think all trams should go. But the whole process sort of gathered momentum, and you got people, even when you got places like Glasgow, who continued building trams until the 1950s, you got other people, other councillors who would say, look, everyone's getting rid of their trams, they're outdated. And it became an unstoppable snowball, basically.
There was a resistance movement?
There really wasn't much of a resistance movement. The tram industry had this division between private and the publicly controlled sector. The industry was also divided because they had a couple of very strong voices, one in Wolverhampton, one in Manchester. Now, the Manchester tramway manager wanted to replace his trams with buses. The Wolverhampton one wanted to replace his trams with trolleybuses. and they both thought this was the best thing since sliced bread. And they really didn't want to know about modernising the existing trams at all. So they basically frustrated any unified voice. Now, the electricity industry went to the tram industry in 1931 and said, will you mount a joint campaign to save the trams? And the Municipal Tramways Association, which was the voice of the council-owned trams, said no. Why? Because there was this division. There were people like the Manchester man and the Wolverhampton man who basically argued that it was a local matter and the local decision. So there was no national unified fight back. I mean, basically, the tram industry just collapsed politically.
And it was incredibly fast, really, because, as you say, this report came out in 1931, and really within 20 years, there was very little left of the trammers.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, London went in 52, Glasgow went in 62. Yeah. I mean, it went very quickly. And the tram industry, I mean, apart from a few isolated towns who held out for a bit longer, like Glasgow, it basically collapsed. I mean, going back to, the municipal trading argument, so whether councils should be allowed to run trams and things like that. Aberdeen, for example, in the early 50s, went to Glasgow and said, will you build us some new trams? And Glasgow said, we're not allowed to by law.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was that true?
Yeah.
Blackpool did keep its trams.
Blackpool did keep
And
its tram.
how did that happen?
Basically, you have this tram that goes along the front.
Yeah.
It's part of the Blackpool illuminations. It's a great sort of... And also the party conferences always used to be every 2-3 years in Blackpool. And a lot of politicians rather liked it. So when bus deregulation came along in the early 80s, they basically sort of made exemptions to keep Blackpool's trams safe.
Right. Do you think, Mick, that it would have been salvageable? Or do you think that some trams could have survived, quite a lot of trams could have survived? Or do you think that, because there was that added problem that the trams were 30 or 40 years old and therefore needed renewing, didn't they?
Well, not all of them were. There were some new ones. It needed undoubtedly a bit of investment. And the private sector was, much more likely to have poor quality trams, poor quality track. I think you could easily make an argument to say that some trams should still have survived into the modern times, into the 21st century. And they didn't. And that was partly due to the oil industry's campaign and that report from the Royal Commission on Transport.
So those were the two elements, really, that killed it off. And I've always argued that it was probably one of the biggest transport mistakes ever that we wiped out the trams. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of competition, of course.
Yes, rail privatisation is another one.
Yeah, and sort of beaching and, but yes, I think it was undoubtedly a big mistake. And you can see that simply because some cities, Manchester, Sheffield, Nottingham, have reintroduced them. And it's a tacit acceptance that it was a big mistake in the first place.
Well, Mick, that's absolutely fantastic. Your book is called The Great Tramway Conspiracy, and I'm sure it's now available in all good bookshops, and it's published by Pen and Sword. And I really recommend it as anybody interested in transport planning and the fact that there are actually conspiracies that work. Whereas I'm not a great conspiracy theorist, but this is a genuine conspiracy that actually eliminated a fantastic form of transport. So thank you for being on Calling All Stations, Mick, and I hope your book does well.
Christian, Mick has unearthed an extraordinary story about how we were left with just one tram line in Great Britain, the Blackpool system. But there's also a legacy, isn't there, of the difficulty that's been experienced in constructing new tram systems over the last 30 years.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we're bad at making new trams, and there has been several schemes that were knocked on the head by Alistair Darling in places like Leeds and Liverpool and Gosport. He's scrapped proposed schemes, and even where schemes have gone through, they've been very expensive to build because, unlike in other countries, the tram company or the tram builder is responsible for moving the utilities, responsible for building effectively a road that can withstand HGVs on the road, whereas in fact, the HGVs or the Department for Transport should pay for that generally, but in fact you end up with anybody who wants a tram or is building a tram paying vast amounts of money to reinforce roads, not because the trams are so heavy, but because they're also used by HGVs and you don't want them collapsing. And there's obstacles put in the way of tram building throughout the process. And so therefore you have to compare with the fact that France, which almost wiped out all its trams as well, has 25 towns and cities with trams, and we only have half a dozen. We have none being constructed at the moment. I mean, the Keir Starmer has just okayed, hopefully, the system in West Yorkshire, but that's nowhere near kind of even beginning to be built.
And that's just giving it a fair wind, isn't it? I mean, there's no actual commitment of money or consenting powers to that project.
Absolutely. And it really is depressing because trams are so amazing at stimulating urban regeneration. And as I have kind of said many times, whenever you get a tram system in a town or city, that becomes the emblematic thing that they stick on their annual report, or the mayor's kind of welcome to the city, or whatever. They're always proud of their trams, and people like them, and the middle classes use them in a way that they might not always use buses, and so on. They're a real stimulus to urban regeneration. And the other aspect I'd just like to mention about this book, which is that it has resonance with other modes of transport, right? The railways are always up against it in terms of having to defend themselves because, they don't always pay their way. And, that the fact that really doesn't matter because they pay their way through all sorts of what economists call externalities. In other words, they help lots of people who don't actually use the railways. And yet, they always have to defend themselves. We had a huge series of cuts with beaching, which was, similar to really what happened to the trams. And there was an element of conspiracy about that as well. So, and the whole privatization was actually stimulated by, again, the whole idea that British Rail was inefficient and British Rail didn't innovate, which, as I showed in my book on British Rail, is completely untrue. British Rail innovated enormously and did all sorts of kind of interesting things, not least creating brands like Intercity and so on. And what's more, it was the most efficient railway network in Europe. And yet, it succumbed to privatization because essentially, Mark, it was again a conspiracy theory. It was the kind of purveying of actually wrong information just in lots and lots of places. Mick Hamer calls that astroturfing, which is a very interesting expression, because astroturfing basically means that you're pretending there is a grassroots movement against something when there isn't one. And astroturf has no grassroots, and that's why it's called astroturfing, which I never knew before. I think we can see that in other parts of society today. It's, social media kind of encourages astroturfing to a great extent because, anybody can post anything online and then that's it. So it's a story that has resonance beyond its immediate remit of kind of putting the demise of the trams in context.
As part of the integrated national transport strategy for England, which we covered a couple of podcast episodes ago, the government did commit to establishing a mass transit task force to try to identify what the obstacles are to tramways and similar systems being developed. And that has actually now been set up. So perhaps that's something that we'll return to in a future episode to see what progress it's making and whether some of these consequences of that dark conspiracy against the trams can be reversed.
Yes, Mark, but it's a typical, let's do something that makes us look like we're doing something, but it's going to take a lot of time. Walmart and Walker sitting down together in a darkened room for 2 days could probably write the paper and explain actually the whole history and why it's been so difficult and present it to government. But, that's not the way things are done, unfortunately.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, for once, Mark, this is entirely good news. Loyal listeners, as you always call them, which I rather like, will remember that about 3 years ago, we actually led on a story that we uncovered, which was the fact that the government wanted to do away, the Tory government at the time, wanted to do away with Wi-Fi on trains. They said, it's all unnecessary. People can just use their mobiles to get coverage, and they don't need trains to have Wi-Fi. And you and I kind of released this story, and we got lots of coverage on all sorts of media outlets, both TV and radio and newspapers. And lo and behold, we actually stopped that from happening because it was just too embarrassing. I mean, this is mid or the second decade of the 21st century, and you're talking of kind of getting rid of Wi-Fi on trains. It was absolute madness. It was my least favorite transport secretary of all time, Mark Harper, who is now sadly in the House of Lords. But anyway, so we stopped that, and now we've got the announcement that not only has that policy been reversed, but the government has committed itself to greatly expanding the Wi-Fi coverage on trains, kind of guarantee it pretty much for whole journeys, and even enabling people to do Zoom calls and download films and actually have far greater capacity than ever before. And this will encourage people to use trains. It will enable them to work on trains, to have maybe Zoom meetings on trains, all this kind of stuff. So, this is really good news. And hey, we can claim a little bit of credit for calling all stations for having kind of set out this strategy.
Thank you for listening to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Warmar, which is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please do consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media. You can find Cogitamus Limited, Calling All Stations podcast, Christian Warmar and Mark Walker across a variety of platforms, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky and X.